Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Friday SLO talk. My name is Adequacy. I'm the Student Learning Outcomes Coordinator from Santa Ana College. And this morning, we have a pleasure to have with us Dr. Shamini from Claremont Graduate School of Education. She's here to talk to us about equity in assessing learning, disrupting legacy practices for anti-racist, inclusive practices. Dr. Dias, it's a pleasure to have you. We remember you from the SLO symposium that we just had back in January. Your speeches, your insights are always very well received. So thank you very much for joining us. We are certainly welcome to. We are looking forward to the conversation. What I'm going to do is after your main presentation, so to speak, during which may include some questions. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll just continue with our conversation if there's more questions. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Dias.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here. I see people are introducing themselves on chat. That's really great. I saw somebody beaming in from South Africa, so welcome. We've gone international a little bit, and that's wonderful. So what I'm going to do, it's a mouthful of a topic, and I really would like this to be as much of a conversation as we can. And so the way I've designed it is I'm going to share a kind of a proposal with you. I would like to unpack and invite you to think along with me as I share that unpacking of what I call legacy assessment methods and thinking. And then at the end, I really would, because this is a big topic, and I'll say this probably a few times. Assessment is at the very heart of learning, right? But assessment, I would feel, also hurts the heart of learning in many, many ways. And it's not an easy thing to just undo it and do something different, right? Transformation, we think of the word transformation, is very big. But really, with the work we do in our classrooms, there's such power in that small move that you can make, that little thing you can do. So I would love for us, one of my goals for us today is to walk away after the conversation, having shared ideas. You're probably doing a lot of wonderful things. And I hope you'll recognize that as we go through, to share what you're doing already, to ask the difficult questions about, well, how on earth am I going to do that? Right? Because these are the important questions to ask. We don't promise that we all together would have all the answers, but I think we can promise that together, all of us could have some really good ideas to go back and try. All right. So I'm going to share my slides now, walk you through some material, some ideas for thinking, and then leave a good amount of time for us to talk. Okay. So let me get my screen going. Hang on a bit. Okay. All right. So now as I go, what I love for you to do is, okay, there you go. Think along with me. Use chat. So Yarek will be watching for questions, right? And we may, and Yarek, feel free if there's an immediately need to answer question, I'm happy to just stop and address it. But some of the bigger questions we're going to keep for the end. I do want to leave time for conversation. But I'm also, as I said earlier, before everybody arrived, I think, is that one of the lovely things about online presentations is that you can think aloud along with me. So put your thoughts into chat in parallel. If I say something that you really, really like, or you're puzzled by, or you don't agree with, or something, have a thought. Share it in chat if you would like to. You don't have to, right? Some of you may prefer, I know I do, to just listen and let it all sink in. I'll tell you a very quick intro of myself. My name is Shamini Dias. And I currently, I founded the Preparing Future faculty in Claremont Graduate University, and I direct it, and that's where I currently am. And my work is in the realm of both academia, and I'm a teaching artist, so I also work with people in different places, communities and school and non-school situations. So a lot of my practice is based on the notion of, actually, I would say my practice is centered on the idea of joy. And with joy comes equity and justice. And assessment is a very, very dear to me topic, because it is also a place that has a lot of tension and problems with joy. So I'm going to get started. So we begin with this idea of, I love PhD comics, by the way. We begin with this idea of assessment, the association with grading. And what I like about this little strip is the idea of impact. I think that as educators, we care about impact. And that's why equity is a very important thing, is the effect of our assessment practices having an impact in an equitable way, right? And this becomes kind of the theme for this morning. So quick agenda, we're going to try and look at sort of three big areas. First of all, before we dive into the details, I think we need to unpack what we mean by the word assessment. Education is full of what I call opaque language, like participation. What does that mean? There are a lot of assumptions. And so much with the word assessment. I have a theory I haven't actually fully tested out, but my hypothesis is, look at all of us. We are products of assessment. We did well. We succeeded. Somehow we got through it. We did our degrees. Now we are teachers, in turn assessing others. And in many ways, because sense-making, meaning is a very embodied phenomenological thing, how much of that word, and therefore our practice, is informed and shaped by the kind of assessments we've been through? And not just the kind of assessments we've been through, but the deep-seated assumptions and values associated with assessments. And if we are part of the legacy system and are products of it, then how much does that legacy system inhabit us and shape the way we even think about this word assessment? So we're going to do a quick little exercise to unpack and get on the same page with that. Then we're going to go a little deeper and surface how traditional assessment poses barriers and oppression. So we really want to question this. And having done that, we want to think, okay, so if we want to roll up our sleeves and do something about this, what do we do? And I'm going to look at three areas. Remove barriers, that's good. But invite growth and joy, better. Invite meaningfulness and relevance, right? And that is going to be really what we want to do. Okay? So let's do this. We're going to define assessment. In your own space. Now, if you feel you want to share on chat, you totally are welcome to do that, right? But if you just want to think about this word, assessment, and think of one word, just one, that explains this word. Assessment is one word. I'll give you a moment to think. Beautiful. Oh, yes. Nice. Okay, so you see the stream of words and all the different things that as a community we're bringing in: evidence, growth, critical thinking, progress. And oh, by the way, when we do this kind of work together, I want to invite you to, there's an artist I love very, very much. His name is Austin Kleon, and he has a book called Steal Like an Artist. And it's an amazing book, because what it says is, be inspired. If you see a good idea, go use it, right? Make it your own, though. right? So if you see words you like that you weren't thinking of, because this is your thought, top of the head thinking in a moment, if you see another word and it resonates with you, take it. If you see a word that puzzles you, pause. Because if it puzzles you, that's something that is not um, front of your mind. And you need to, if it puzzles you, like, why is they thinking of that word? That is exactly where you need to think. How can I connect with that word, right? So puzzlement is good, which is actually also a very important point for our designing assessment. So here are some words. We saw many of these words in chat, right? And some of the words that are not in chat. I'm collecting these, by the way. It's my little hobby. I collect all these words. I will add them to the slide. So I also forgot to say you will have the set of slides, and I will maybe take a day or so to add anything we've learned to the slide, so you will have that captured. But the words you have is like multi-step I don't have, so I'm going to be definitely adding it here. I'll run out of slide space eventually. But the word I really wanted to, and I saw a few instances of the word growth. And I really want us to focus on that today. Assessment, if you ask the big why question, it's about growth. Might be about all these other things too, but fundamentally, the why of it is about growth. So thank you for that sharing. Now come along with me on a visual tour, right? So we have the one word definition. We have a cluster of ideas. I'm going to show you some pictures of assessment in school, assessment outside of school. And we want to think through these 4 questions. Who's assessing? What is being assessed? Why is that assessment being done? And what is the likely emotional profile in that kind of assessment? All right. So here's our first stop. Traditional, very traditional, on the very far end of schooling, legacy assessment. The teacher's assessing, or there's a bunch of teachers waiting to assess what is produced here. What is being assessed? So pause and think about that. The knowledge they learned, maybe it's a history test, right? Maybe it's statistics or math. But if you think about it as more deeply, when you look at the paper and when you find the grade, is what is being assessed privilege? You know, that student is what is being assessed how hungry a student was and couldn't focus? Is what is being assessed how I had a tutor and really was coached for this particular test? Is what is being assessed that I just lost my job last week and I'm panicking? So when you think about this kind of assessment, the thing that is being assessed becomes less blurry when you look at it from an equity lens. Why do we do this kind of assessment? Well, to see if they've learned, right? To see if they've grown. But when it gets complicated with what exactly we're assessing, then you don't know why the assessment is being done. It's also done, this kind of assessment is done as gatekeeping. Can they go to the next level? Can they get to the next class? You know, in many countries, they also have university exams, entrance exams. In this country, we have SATs, which thankfully are being less and less required for entrance to college. It's the idea of gatekeeping is something very powerful with our legacy system. And the emotional profile for this tends to be, you know, it could be, I feel confident, I feel prepared, but the emotional profile overwhelmingly tends to be, I'm scared. Oh, you know, this is just a mess, anxiety, stress levels, you know, distractions. That's what often happens, right? The affective domain in this space is not happy usually. And when you then granulate by population, which students are going to have more test anxiety, right? who's had test coaching and who hasn't, how to take a test, right? So this is this particular kind of assessment. Let's take a look at another one. So this might be the written form. Very similar things going on, but there's something interesting. The teacher's assessing. What exactly is being assessed is both the content and the dreaded red pen. Absolutely. You know how much conditioning there is, right? Have we ever questioned? Maybe I could use purple. I know a teacher who says to oh, I see the red pen. I have a friend who asks the students to give her. She has a whole bunch of colored pens. She says, pick one, give it to me. I'll use that to give you feedback. And just that little switch is wonderful because the students pick the color, they're more likely to read the feedback because she was so puzzled by the fact that she's giving them positive, formative action feedback. But they just look at the paper and they don't want to look at it. So, I mean, just this alone is a whole webinar, right? How to give feedback, but we won't go there today. But what is being assessed is the content knowledge, but also a particular form of articulation. And we live in a world where there are a diverse forms of articulation. But the overwhelming assessment being done, I'm so pleased to see in many schools, multiple modes of assessment, a very UDL approach, but it's still overwhelmingly is this form of assessment. For many teachers, because, well, how else am I going to do it in a rigorous way? So we'll talk about rigor in a bit. Why is it being done? More gatekeeping to see if they can write in this particular academic genre. Now, we're not saying the academic genre is not important because it's currency for the students. If they don't know how to write this way, you're putting something in front of them. But this is not the only currency in the world. And so we need to broaden and diversify also in this kind of context. And the similar kind of emotional profile could be pretty negative. Now we look at this one. This is still school, but it looks very different suddenly, right? Who is doing the assessing here is no longer just the teacher. It's the students themselves. There's some peer assessment happening. What is being assessed? Also content knowledge. Do you know enough about the botany and what you learned about permaculture to be doing that planting? Did you prepare the soil right? All of that's being assessed, content knowledge, but it's also assessing many, many other things. Connection, communication, collaborative work, how students can work together. These are life skills also. Unfortunately, in some of this work that's being done out there, the rubric is still only on content. We need to expand our assessment criteria too. Why is it being done? To check for understanding, to check for the learning, but it's also being done to allow students to have a kind of agency and voice in how they are being assessed, especially if the students have helped to write the criteria. And the emotional profile could still be scared, etc., but much less likely to be. It's much more likely to be anticipation, curiosity. Oh my gosh, is it going to work? Oh, it's not working. What do we do? Right? So that there's a lot more energy in this kind of emotional energy that's positive in this kind of assessment context. Next one. We leave school because I think it's really important to understand what happens in school by looking at what happens outside. Think about a time in your life where you learned to do something difficult, rock climbing, learning to cook, as in this example, learning to sew, going to the gym and learning how to do that whole workout routine. You had assessment. You had to figure out if you were moving. Remember the idea of growth that we had. You had to grow. And in this assessment, the learner is self-assessing. What is being assessed? Well, does it taste good? Does it smell good? Does it look good? Right? It's a very experiential. It's also content. Like, did I follow the recipe right? Or if they're not using a recipe, did I figure it out? Right? Why is it being done? There is some kind of authentic audience here. I use this as a metaphor for that authentic audience. Um, will they like it? Will they love the food? Will my kids enjoy this? Will my friends enjoy this dish? How am I doing as a cook? Am I getting better? So the assessment is done, in order to provide something. And the emotions tend to, again, like the group work stuff, they become much more positive. Of course, in my cooking, there's also a lot of panic, but it's toward this joy, and there's a lot more joy. So that word that I wanted to bring in, the joy and growth, they come in. And this is the last stop on our tour. And this is the fundamental aspect of being human, learning to grow, growing. Who's assessing? The child and the parent. What is being assessed? Their ability to do something very, very important: walking, cycling. Um, Ability is being assessed. Why is it being done? Because both the child and the parent are really invested in growth, in flourishing. And the emotions tend to be really positive in these situations. Look, I'm doing it. I'm cycling, right? Uh, it's that excitement, anticipation, curiosity, wonder, the wonder of the child. And I know this is children, but one of the things we have to remember is that of all the qualities of humanity, the most fundamental gift given to us, that we are designed neurologically and physically to learn. That is what it is, really basic to being human. And when you put equity into the picture and ask, why are some people, some students, blocked from learning? Why is the capacity to learn and to have a sense of wonder and joy and a sense of, oh wow, I can do this? Why for many, many kids is that taken away? Right? This is our birthright, no matter where you are born in the world, right? And socially, because of various histories, some people don't have this. This is the greatest privilege we can all have, but we take it away. So for me, this picture is very important, because when I'm in my classroom with college age kids and we are trying to think about assessing their knowledge of, good writing and rhetoric, which is one of the things I teach, I want to come back to this and say, how do I bring an element of this into the way in which I assess that learning? And when you think of this, then you must also realize that today we're talking about assessment, but what lies underneath the assessment, like the iceberg, is how we teach. Right? So it's a very big conversation. All right, so this is just a consolidation so that when you have the slides, you can just take a look of these four I use these four as metaphors for assessment. And you can see the shifts and changes that happen across different approaches, different philosophies, and different methods, different contexts that we create around assessment. Um, so I hope this will be useful to you. And what you want to know is that these are, for the convenience of presenting, seem to be a grid. But there are wonderful spaces where these things meld and merge. So how can we bring a little bit of the sensory pleasure and sense of challenge and progress into a quiz? How can we bring curiosity into a written paper, right? How can we bring that sense? So the emotional profile is really, really important. If you can start thinking there's a book I have for you in my references called The Spark of Learning by Sarah Rose Kavanagh, who talks about the neuroscience of emotions and how it can activate classrooms. So I hope this will consolidate that tour for you. And now I'm going to just pause we're going to go and look at the inequities and oppressions, but I'm really going to take a quick scan through the chat, because I know things have been flowing in. Um, Yeah, I see employability skills rubrics are embedded. That's great. Group work is hard online, right? So that speaks to teaching. And maybe we can come back to some of these in the actual conversation. I'm just trying to inform myself as we go. Group work. I always ask my students in the Preparing Future Faculty program, how many of you love to do group work with your students? And like 2 hands will go up in a room of 30. But oh, wow, group work. If we can learn to do it, well, it is very powerful. Um, I like we are designed to learn. I'm glad people are, if you pick up a thing that you heard, that would be a good kind of a tagline. Put it in chat, share it with people. Yeah, a lot of stuff on group work. So maybe we'll go there at the end. The pandemic and stress, yes. And you know something my students told me? They said, Professor Dyers, I've had this stress even before the pandemic. The pandemic's just making it come up to you. And that's a moment to stop and think. Like these things have been going on in our students' lives. It just were not very visible. Okay. The book title and author. Okay, it's let me put it in chat. Spark of Learning. Sarah Rose Kavanagh. I can't spell Kavanagh. Cavanagh. Okay, there you go. Right, but I have linked it for you. I have it for you in my resources slide. So when you get the slides, that's a good book. It's a great book. Okay. Oh, thanks, Yarek. So let's now go into, okay, we've defined assessment. We've looked at the context of assessment, but now let's take a look. And I want to kind of bring us to the space of critical pedagogy. And I have for you, whoops, hang on. I have for you 2 books by Freire down in the resources, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which many of us know. And he's got this other one, The Pedagogy of Freedom, which is another fantastic book. But the big ideas are his idea of conscientization and authenticity. And if you read other authors, Bettina Love, Ladson Billings, Henry Giroux, Geneva Gay, if you read these people, you will see the place that they all begin, they cohere, right? I actually did like a qualitative analysis of their narratives. And one of the big themes was this thing about liberation, humanizing based on love for the world. These are actually more Freirean articulations of it, but these were the themes that I found in like 6 or 7 different authors. Learning must move away, this again taking, I like Freire's language for this, from a transmission or banking of knowledge to a problem posing and empowerment of the student. Now, this is about learning. We read this and then we go and do assessment, right? What we want to do is to say, how does this become assessment? How does this happen for assessment? Because learning and assessment are so connected. So I want us to be guided for this morning by 3 questions. Do traditional assessments measure privilege and barriers, as we saw in that context, more than learning? How do they erase the joy of learning? How do they prepare learners for life? 3 areas, because one of the areas of equity that we don't think about often because we're so busy fighting for equity now is, are we fighting for equity in the future? Are we setting people up for life flourishing, right? Or will inequities follow them forward? So the first one, you've had a good idea of this already just with that tour, but I wanted to introduce you to this framework. This is actually a developmental psychologist, Uri Bronfenbrenner. He has a socio-ecological theory of development. Now, in equity work, I find this really useful to think of a systems perspective of equity. Socio-ecological determinants of learning. The whole idea of this is that there are many different levels of systems, microsystems, mesosystems, macro systems, right? Even Bronfenbrenner brings in time, chronosystems. How is my identity given to me by time, my history? Do I come from a history of slavery? Do I come from a history of immigration? No. Do I come from a history of privilege? That is part of the system that shapes me and my interactions in the world. And then the sort of expanding circles, my immediate home, the community, the schools, the country, the laws, the policies. Who you are is as much a product of all this as anything else. So when you recall that I said that the biggest fundamental gift, our birthright, our identity as a human being is the capacity to learn. And then we have these identities given to us by our socio-ecological spaces. This is, you can teach a whole class on this, but kind of mind-blowing when you get into the weeds. But I've pulled out for you some of the ones particularly important to education. These are different systems. Social role and identities, that is already in itself very big. Time and space, right? Learning environments. Do I have time to go to the library? I used to teach high school a very long time ago, and there was a student really messing up on all her assessments, on her homework. And what I found out was the family has one table,
Okay, okay.
one, and on a weekend, they play mahjong, and she doesn't have a table to do work. And it affected her performance, right? So time and space are really important, and we can easily forget it. Wealth, of course, the physiological and neurological things, how much of our assignments are designed for a particular neurodominant type, and how much do we think about neurodiversity? Emotions, literacies, that's going to be a big one, because no longer do we have reading and writing only, right? This is also an interesting model about what our students bring with them to the classroom. So when you think about design thinking and you say, who are the learners in the room in front of me? You do this, actually, I do kind of an asset thing rather than a deficit thing. We do an asset collection in our classroom. And it really helps us and it helps the students to think of all the assets they embody. But it also leads to a discussion in a very Freirean way of, so how is school getting in the way of who we are? I think, one of the things that needs more research is this area. What is it our students are bringing with them in all these different dimensions? So coming back to assessments, so when you go to the traditional thing, timed exams, closed books testing, inflexible deadlines, a single modality of assessment. This is traditional. This is the unthinking, unconscious way to assess people that we've been doing for decades. They might be measuring these variables way more than they measure learning. So then our data is rubbish, our assessment data. What do we do with that, right? So how do we get more authentic assessment data? Not an easy answer, but it's definitely an important question. So coming back, I just wanted to remind you, the ability to learn is a fundamental human gift. How do we deny this gift for some? Right? This is just a reminder. Quick case study. I think by now you get this, of course. This student had a tutor, didn't have to work. Parents did college, got grade A. The other student, not so much, got a B minus. Not bad, given the circumstances. So what do our data tell us then about assessment? So traditional assessment ranks these students too. And one of the biggest areas of hurt to the heart of learning is that the student then judges themselves. I'm not very smart. Even though, and here's the kicker, you can try this with your students. When you talk to students and you go over the things that were in their way to getting a good grade, they can tell you, I hadn't eaten for 3 days. That was one of my students. The losing a job. These are all examples from my experience. At the end of it, they'll still turn around and tell you they don't think they're smart. And that's so sad. right? So this is where we do more harm, and we have to change this. Next question, the joy of learning. How do they erase the joy of learning? Now, in this slide and the next one, I'm presenting this almost, it looks like binary, you know, this versus the other, but do know that that's for the convenience of presentation. It's a climb, it's a gradation. There is a beautiful happy space in the middle. And I would like you to think, just not just for yourself, but what you see in your schools, what you see other faculty doing, is toward which end of the scale do we play, right? I see a comment in chat. I would love to hear about how we can combat the comment. I don't want to give up the rigor. Yes, let's talk about rigor. And if I forget, Yara, can you write it down and remind me? Because I get this all the time. How can empathy and rigor, aren't they mutually exclusive? I'm empathetic, I can't be rigorous. I would say, short answer first, and we'll get to it later in more detail. Rigor, let's question the word. Oh, by the way, the etymology of rigor and the other meanings of rigor, rigor mortis, don't want that kind of rigor. What we want is soundness, accuracy, you know, good, valid testing. And how rigorous are our data if they're really assessing privilege, right? That's not rigorous. Our methods are not rigorous then. So I would question that. But I think, you know, if you're working, if any of you are working with faculty, you want to lead them gently to unpack the rigor. And one thing, it's not to say push back and say you can't do multiple choice testing. How do we do it in a way that makes space for real learning? And I'm sure I do have something coming up on that when we get to the methods part, like the transformation part. Okay, but back to this slide. So in traditional assessment, what I would call the logic of assessment, right? The assumptions of assessment is that mistakes have penalties. It's kind of a given. That our judgment, and we are having judgments of inadequacy. And I'll tell you this, even if you don't think so, the students think so. Because we unfortunately teach at the top end of conditioned learning. If you've had the pleasure of working with young students, young learners, and I have 5, 4, 7, they don't judge themselves as inadequate. They very much say, yeah, I didn't get it that time. Let me try again. Right? So that again that you see in children at 5, and I've tracked the same child across years of schooling. Schooling undoes a natural propensity to learn. Right? So because we teach at college level, we have to be very cognizant that these assumptions are actually our assumptions shared with students. Students really embody this. They judge themselves, they compare, they compete. Tell me what I need to do to get the grade. I don't want to do all the other stuff, right? They've been totally conditioned to not like learning, but to want the good grade. And it's not their fault, right? What we have to do is undo it with them. And there's more of a likelihood of negative emotions. So on the non-schooling side, if you remember some of the things that you've gone and learned yourself, mistakes are points of discovery. I think there's a whole area called how do we think about error? That's really important for teachers and students. It's often both individual and collaborative. It's focused on growth. There are more knowledgeable others around us. So when you think of closed book exams, right? And then you think of somebody, your boss, somebody tells you, hey, you need to come up with this project, write this thing. What do? You Google things, you ask people, and then you put it together. But that's not how we test people, right? So the non-schooling assessment space can give us lots of good ideas for the kind of positive emotional profile that we want to bring in, for the kind of real learning that we want to have happen. And this is our third question. How do traditional assessments prepare learners for life? So in this one, Same thing, I'm presenting what seems like a binary, but that arrow at the bottom tells you it's a gradation, and there's a happy space to be playing in the middle. This one is something that I feel of all the areas of assessment we don't talk about enough, maybe because we have so many other problems to deal with. But this is understanding the world in which we live and the world in which our students are going to be going and working in. The a little historical thing, right? Our current system, the legacy system of education and even work world, is about 100 years old, right? Um, and in that world, knowledge is a thing acquired and contained in oneself. Just think of leaders. Leaders are individuals, right? Knowledge and skills are stable and change slowly. This is the world of the 20th century pre-internet. And I think internet was a big game changer. Individual expertise, people look to the expert, people look to competitive performance. It's how you're judged in every space in life, but especially in school, right? Harvard University, for their PhDs, I think as far back as 2001 is my memory of it, had dissertations done collaboratively. Can you imagine that? That two or three people worked on a big research project and they each wrote their dissertations out of it. And I thought this was phenomenal. That is a meaningful dissertation. Whereas, all of us, we've got our PhDs, right? We had to do it on our own and even have a name for it. It's called an occluded genre. Um, it's the kind of thing you write once ever in your whole life, but okay, but that's kind of 1% of the population. But I thought that was a really good anecdote, that there was a recognition at one place in one school that knowledge is not always an individual expertise, right? And there are prescribed modes of expression and communication, that there's only one or two ways to do things. Think of the 21st century, think of post-internet. Knowledge, you know, your phone has more knowledge in it than the mainframe computer from a few decades ago. This thing. Knowledge is distributed beyond my brain. It's there, and I must know how to get it. That's the thing. Knowledge is fast changing and fluid. I want to pause here. when was it? 1897, John Dewey wrote, and I'm paraphrasing him, I can't remember exactly. We don't know what the world will be like 20 years from now. And all we can do is prepare the learner to encounter that world. Well, that's really true today. In 2006, if you know Ken Robinson, he said almost the same thing. And I don't know if he was quoting, it was at a talk. I don't know if he was quoting John Dewey, but he said, we don't really know what the world will be like in 5 years. And all we have to do is prepare the kids to get there. But look at the compression of time, 20 years, 5 years, right? The pace of change is so fast. Crowdsourcing, just-in-time learning, and learning how to learn. This is what we look to, right? And we want to think whether our assessments are assessing this as much as they assess content knowledge. And then the multiple modalities in this huge way of communicating. We have to do more than reading and writing. So learning, unlearning, relearning, that's an Alvin Toffler quote, who said, the illiterate of the 21st century will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And then adding to that, in these many different forms, cultural competencies, cultural communication, oral, gestural, digital, analog, we need all of it. And how do we prepare our students in the learning and assessment space? How do we know? How do we know? We have to assess them. How do we know they're going out there with all these skills? So suddenly assessment is a whole different game if you think of future-focused teaching and learning, right? So how are you preparing people for the emerging world? quick thing. I think you, if you've Googled, there you go, for Bloom, you might encounter the Bloom's taxonomy with the word Google across the bottom. And it's kind of a reminder to say, we use Bloom's a lot. I love this taxonomy. I think it's a really good reminder of moving towards a higher order thinking skills that we should really be looking at create, evaluate, analyze a lot more. Do I need to test whether you know and remember something? I need to test whether you know how to Google it. You know how to Google it. You know how to evaluate what you Google. You know how to tell me why this is a better thing than the other. That's what I should be testing you on. And Fink's taxonomy, very, very much a 21st century. This book, his book was published in 2003. Pretty new, right? And if you look at this, he's not even hierarchical about it. And this is a recognition of how do we design significant learning and test for significant learning in a complex world. And this, I feel, helps us to think more about equity, inclusion, and diversity than just Bloom's by itself. You know, Bloom's is good to do that. Can I evaluate in an inclusive way? Can I analyze? You know, this is all fine. But I think Fink gives us so many wonderful areas to explore and say, I will design an assessment that is going to evaluate whether my class knows how to learn. That's an important assessment. How do I do it? I can't sit down and make them fill in a test for it. How do I assess it? So when you start granulating using Think, you can assess beyond content, knowledge, and skills, but it will force you, which I love about it, to think of different ways, to think of informal and formal assessments, and to think of co-assessing with your students, because some of this cannot be learned except through almost like a little research project with your students to see how they're doing. Okay. Right now, what I'd like you to do, again, share in chat if you like, but you don't have to at all. I've thrown a lot at you. So I'm really going to pause for like a good a while. Write a definition. What is, if you had to go back and explain to someone, yeah, you know, equity-minded assessment, this is how I think about it, what would you say? While you're doing that, I am enjoying everything you've written in chat. Okay. And, you know, we can keep developing that, but I hope you got some thoughts down. It's nice after I've been just yakking away for a while to kind of stop and have that silence. And I hope that was good also for you for thinking. I got a few questions, which we can get into a little bit more later, but a quick one in response to somebody who asked about Angela Duckworth's work on grit. And that reminds me of other work on resilience. You know, all that work is really good. If you read the research and you see what they're after, positive psychology. I worked with Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who was one of the founders of positive psychology. He's a professor at CGU. Um, and I was part of his lab. And the reason Mike and Martin Seligman, the co-founder of positive psychology, set up positive psychology. I don't know if you heard the story, but they did a very simple test, being scientists. They went through hundreds of journal articles in psychology and asked one question. Does it address trauma and pathology, or does it address growth and flourishing? And 90, I forget the percentage, but 96 point something was trauma and pathology. But of course, because, you know, we're trying to, like medicine is looking at trauma, we're trying to cure, right? But psychology. So they said, that's all fine. We're not saying that's wrong, but it's unbalanced. So they set up positive psychology to study the other side of the human condition. And I love that. And grit, resilience, hope, love, all the stuff they study is wonderful. But I'll say this about grit and resilience and how it's been applied to schools. It's been applied as a band-aid. It's been a little intervention to say, we're going to make you more resilient, but we're not going to change the system that's oppressing you. You know, you're just going to survive better in this. And that kind of saddens me, right? It's not what we want to do. What we want to do here, what we're talking about here is how do we take something as big as assessment and as hurtful as assessment has become and undo it. Now, it doesn't mean we don't teach students to be persistent through the process, to have resilience and grit, to do the work in that schooling space, because those are life skills they need. But we can't do it to the exclusion of us perpetuating the oppressions that we put on them. We need to do something on our side, right? So that's just the response to that one, because that was a private message, and I thought, no, I'll answer it that now. Okay, so let's go on. Now we're going to move into all right, how do we do the things we want to do? This is the hard part, okay? How do we embrace diversity, design inclusively, and integrate equity? That's the big question. And this hard part, I'll be presenting ideas, strategies from the actual practice of people in the field, from my practice, from the practice of many of my students, from the practice of many of my colleagues, and also from the practice I've read in the research literature. I know the questions that's going to come up a lot is, oh, but I can't do that because, or how do I do that? That seems crazy. Hold the thoughts. All right. We'll talk about it some more. And I hope beyond today, we'll talk about some ideas for how to unpack the practices for yourself. We'll talk about that at the end. But this is just a model that I use to talk about where we want to go as educators who are going to be ethical educators, that the transmission model of education, if I wanted to pull out some themes, is this old idea that teachers are the authority, it's teacher driven, students are, you know, the blank slate. This is Freire's banking education. We fill them up with knowledge. And if you watch yourself talking, sometimes you use that language, the metaphor of transmission. I've got to, I got to transmit so much information to them and they have to absorb the stuff. You know, it's so unconscious in us. That students are all homogenous, which we all know is not true, but our practices sometimes reveal that that's the deeper assumption. That knowledge is canonical. This is the disciplinary knowledge and this is, sacrosanct. That there is a dominant perspective on how to do things and it's based on student compliance. The empowerment model really moves away from that, where students share authority. Paul Hansted, he wrote a book called Creating Wicked Students. And wicked, he means like the wicked problems of the world for a complex world, right? He says giving students authorship. By authority, he means giving them authorship of their own learning. Co-creating with students, students therefore have agency. We know it's very diverse. You take a systems view. And this idea of knowledge. Knowledge is multidimensional and created all the time. And that there are multiple perspectives of how to do something. And it's not compliance, it's meaningful application. So this is the model that guides the method. This I wanted to bring to your attention. Many of you might have seen this if you work with or connect with the National Institute of Learning Outcome Assessment. And the link was there on the slide. This is their list of equity-based assessment principles. And I think, more of us, we should bring this to faculty meetings. We should have a faculty retreat just studying these, 6 principles and talk about it and have an awful frank conversation, fight over this. Because I think sometimes it will come to that argument where argument is a dance, not a clash, right? Can we debate this? And what I have done, if you want to actually do that for yourself as an individual or do this with your faculty in a department, is I've created a kind of an audit list that you can use based on these 6 principles. I do this myself at the end of semester before I design my next course to check myself. I do this with my team in the Preparing Future Faculty program, and I do this with faculty. So as a department, you can say, what is my assessment philosophy? And is that philosophy who I am? Is that harming or blocking students? Who am I harming or blocking? Right? And because you use this in a real context, you can actually name names and name students. You can do that, ground it in reality. Do I have multiple ways to gauge how students are learning and make space for them? Did I do that last semester? And again, case, you need to do this with almost like a case study of yourself in a department and go, yeah, we need to do more here, right? Do I ask my students for feedback? Oh yeah, nobody did that this semester, right? Should we? Do I co-create assessments with my students? Oh, we don't know how to do that. Let's learn. Do I use peer and self-assessment in my classes? So you can look at how a department is doing equity, because we talk a lot, these words, we throw them around, equity, inclusion, diversity. But the question is, how do we do it? Do I provide transparent assignments? And I'll actually go into that in a little bit. Do I use success checklists, rubrics, in other words, but no points, just the checklist of this is what you need to do to be successful? Do I use formative, metacognitive work? If you can audit yourself, and if you're not doing all of it, it doesn't matter. But if this is your guide, like your compass, and you can audit yourself, then you can make those little critical catalytic changes, which could have a butterfly effect that it has some huge impact. And remember, we started with the cartoon. We want to have impact. This is how you do it, right? Okay. I see someone's mentioning, yes, Tilt Higher Ed is a great resource. I have that on the slides as well for you. This is, you might have seen this is floating around everywhere, but equity, beyond equity going to justice, is not the idea of equity differentiating different things for different people, but actually, because that actually doesn't work for all. What about invisible inequities that we don't realize we're not addressing? So this is a UDL perspective, Universal Design for Learning. Till learning has no limits is their tagline, which I love. Take away the fence already, right? Take down the barrier. So this is another reminder to say, is our assessment doing this? Not just how we teach. Okay. So another slide to remind you, if you're reviewing these slides, do I think the learners are not up to the mark, or do I think the design is not up to the mark? This is really important, right? Because we tend to go, these students. No, this design. Sometimes it is these students, but you will always have the student who has decided. But even then, What has happened to them in their lives? Okay, I can't fix that in the 16 weeks I have with them, but I can always, always, always look at my design. That's what I can do every single time. Um, the purpose. So in the examples and the strategies I'm going to share with you, we're going to do these four things. How do we make learning visible? How do we foster responsive, persistent learning? How do we celebrate and foster metacognition? And why are we doing this? Because we want to do the growth thing, gauge their milestones, take away, change the metaphor in your mind for learning and teaching to journey. If it's a journey, you have to have a compass. You got to stop and take soundings from time to time. And this is all about the growth, right? So the strategies I'm about to share with you, and I have them in three bunches, are going to be around this area. Okay. So the three areas that we want to. One set of strategies is about removing barriers. Another set of strategies is going to be about growth and joy. So how can it be more learning centered? What are the modes and forms that do this? And another set of strategy is about the meaningfulness and relevance. I'm presenting them separately, but I hope you see the massive overlaps that in doing one, we're probably doing the other two. So let's start with the first one, removing barriers. So in this one, I want to show you, and this is that tilt reference someone had, transparent design. Talk a little bit about transparent design, bring that to your attention, talk about process-based and formative tactics, and talk about flexibility. So let's go. Here we go. So transparent design in a nutshell, and in my resource slides in the slide deck, I have references to Marianne Winkelmes is the lead researcher on this. And I have references to the TILT resources, tons, wonderful things, examples, templates, the works. But I wanted to tell you in a nutshell what this is. It means when I give an assignment to a student saying, you know, write an essay on the history of the Boxer Rebellion, 500 words, da da da, you know, make sure you have your resources. That's not very transparent. If I say, this is the assignment, you're going to do this, and this is why we're doing it. There's some really good research, and it's in the references, where professors have done that very simple thing about why we're doing the assignment, and it's made a massive difference to engagement and even academic honesty and things like that. People begin to invest in it because they know why. Especially if the why is relevant to them. Like, why should I care about the Boxer Rebellion? Right? But you say, oh, well, in this assignment, you're building an argument and you're going to have to make arguments in your life, justify points. You're telling them that, making it transparent because students have been conditioned for a long time. It's just a teacher task that they have to do. What is the process? This is where a lot of equity work is done because not everybody knows that they can go and ask a librarian to help them with databases. Not everybody knows that. We assume that. Go to the library, opaque. So we're back to that opaque language. So a task process, what to do. Not hand-holding, not mollycoddling, just making the process pretty clear to them, right? And success criteria. You put your rubric up front with the assignment. So the assignment becomes like a little packet. Here's what it is, what it should look like. Here's why we're doing it. Here's how to do it. And here's some success criteria to guide you along the way, right? That's all that is. The research is phenomenal. They worked with over 40 colleges to explore this, and it was done jointly with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. So the references are there. Do explore it. This is one of the most powerful small moves you can do to make a big change. And then formative feedback, drafts, self and peer review, feedback. I think this one I see more of this happening, but collaborative crowdsourcing, allowing that with students, right? That also goes into open book assessments. Can they take home their assessments? Can they do a quiz multiple times? And then you'll take the best score. Students who are so conditioned to wanting good points, this is a sneaky way of getting them to do a lot of good review. because they will go and review it to get a better score, right? So it's really about learning. Stretch deadlines, preferred and extended dates. This is interesting. It works. I tell them why. I would love for you to get this to me on Wednesdays, but you have till Friday, right? Because then somebody who's working has more of a, they don't get into the negative of affect of, oh my God, I'm missing the stress, right? Just lower it. I tell them why. If you get it to me on Wednesday, I get to grade it. But, if you really cannot get it to me, maybe it comes in on a Friday or Saturday, that's fine. At first, I thought everybody's going to come in late at the end of the extended deadline, but that wasn't true, because part of the conversation is get it in, get it out of your hair, bat it over to me, right? But can we, and doing assessments like that, the final essay is due on such and such a day, giving a stretch deadline won't hurt. So another small move. And avoiding closed book assessments, timed exams. So thinking around those areas. Um, these words in red, you'll see in all of the three areas of strategy, that when we do this kind of removing barrier work, we are building these things: confidence, autonomy, growth mindsets, persistence. And I want to call your attention to the idea of safe fail. In life, we often talk about fail safe. This is what we value, fail safe measures. Great. This comes from a change management researcher, Dave Snowden. And he flipped it around to say, when you work in complex spaces, you want to talk about safe fail. Multiple ways to quickly test out something. The failure is a point of learning something about the context or something about yourself. So allowing students to safely fail is through drafting, through multiple attempts, through rehearsal, safe fail, right? Before you do the performance. No performer would perform having not rehearsed. So safe fail. This is from this paper that I've listed here, and I've put the reference in my resources slides. It's a really interesting paper that kind of did a survey of methods that are being used out there and proposed this little model for authentic assessment in written exams, right? And some interesting ideas. Allowing collaborative answer for complex texts. I've tried that. Students come in and work in groups to put together a project report for the project they've been doing. That's what we're going to assess. They write an individual reflection, which is also part of that. But, to do something a little different, even in a come into class and we're going to do a final exam moment, it's possible. Having students develop grading criteria and so on is very powerful, because they begin to understand deeply what it is and why it is they're doing that work, right? So changing assessment process is a powerful area. Okay, inviting growth and joy. So 4 areas here: safe fail, again, but we're really thinking of curiosity, creativity, and courage. I don't have it in the slide, so I will add it, but I just remembered Brene Brown, she's a psychologist, has an amazing talk about the twinning of courage and vulnerability. It's called Daring Classrooms, and I will list it later. But curiosity, creativity, and courage are important for anyone to learn well. And do our assessment practices kill that? Right? Growth mindsets, agency, co-creation, and the metacognition of learning. So a few areas for strategies. Can we do student-created questions for open quizzes and exams? Curate the questions through the class, use the questions and give it back to them in the exam. So questions come from everybody. Can we have student design essays and projects? So you can keep the traditional form, but you're involving students and helping them find some engagement in the learning process. Can we keep the traditional form of a paper, but have it being written in pairs? Group developed projects with final points of learning reflection. The rehearsal before testing is very much in the space of growth and joy, right? But they do take down barriers too. Can we work with, as part of assessment, think of putting this into your assessment space, learning journals where people keep track of their learning. And at the end, they have to write a final piece that is going to be part of the ending review of how they've learned. Meetings to talk with students. So this is also assessment. Celebrate the courage of learning. So don't just celebrate achievement, but celebrate. I have a teacher who has spectacular fails. And there's a notice board. And because the teacher does project-based learning, and they take pictures of their spectacular fails and put it up there. But from time to time, they're brought into the lab part of class, and they talk about what went wrong. And they're learning so much that this is not bad, that this is failing in order to get good data. And the power of yet using that with us. Okay, so the project didn't work. It's not yet. What do we need to do to get it there? Learning portfolios are ticking up. More people are using learning portfolios, but it's still not very big on the assessment landscape. And we could really put our heads down into how do we curate work products with our students, and then engage them in self and peer assessment. And then finally, yeah, we can do the final assessment. But there's all this assessment that happens formatively before the summative final. The other thing with this is I'm a big fan of the notion of ungrading. There's an author, Susie Bloom, and this book is called Ungrading. Read it. It's brilliant. And she practices this. So, get in touch with her because she'll tell you how to do that and still play within the system of having to submit grades. She was a speaker at a previous SLO symposium, and really delightful work. Okay. And then, I'm seeing lots of great ideas in the chat. And by the way, do you all know you can save the chat? If you don't, just for the benefit of those who don't, the 3 little dots at the bottom, if you click on that, you'll see save chat, and you'll be able to save the chat. So if you want all that conversation, save chat. Okay, last one. Connect with students. This is the meaningfulness piece. Oh, is that feature turned off? Okay, here's what I will do. I will save the chat, and then I will put all the relevant points from chat that are salient to this conversation onto a slide. So wait for the slide link. It'll come to, I'm sure Yarek will be able to share it with you, and then you'll also have the chat. Okay. All right. So last one. This is meaningfulness, relevance. Connect with students' lives and experiences. Think about authentic. This is where it gets really hard, but really fun. Authentic input and audiences. And what about multi-literacies? What's that? Right? So here, it may not begins to look not like assessment. This is really far out. But if you can build this into the learning process and then build assessment points inside of it, this becomes good assessment, authentic assessment. So multi-literacies and UDL. Multi-literacies is an idea that, and I've explained it earlier, of all the different literacies. So do we only have to do the written form? Can they do a spoken presentation? Many of us do presentations. Can they do rap? Can they do a song? Can they do a dialogue as a way to demonstrate knowledge? A conversation between, let's say I'm teaching, one of the things I teach is English literature. So let's say I'm teaching Thomas Hardy, dead white man, and I'm teaching it. But the conversation is between, and one of my students did this, between Thomas Hardy and Ko Pao Kun, local Chinese Singaporean writer. They talk about what's common, what's different, how the world has changed. What the student was doing was questioning critical deconstruction of Thomas Hardy's work, but through the role of a writer they loved and knew in their own space of Singapore. But they presented it as a dialogue with a friend. This is what is assessed. Why not? Right? So that's sort of multi-literacies and universal design, different forms, different modalities. So UDL, I have a link for you at the bottom. They talk about multiple modes of engaging people, multiple modes of representing information. That's really an assessment space. Multiple modes of action and expression. That's also assessment. Too much UDL is used for disability, but UDL is a really good place to get assessment ideas, not even teaching ideas. Co-creation of work, we've talked about multiple times, but these are some of the things that people have done in bringing the meaningfulness and relevance to co-creation, where they connect to current events. So they're learning economics, law of supply and demand. Well, let's take a look at what happened in the pandemic to supply chain, right? Connect to what they want to do. My favorite example is the stats professor who wanted to teach and assess all the stats analyses, descriptive, correlations, multiple regressions, but got the students to pick up an area of data from something they cared passionately about. So he had everything from pop music to environmental degradation, etc. And they ran the analysis and were tested on their data set. But the level of relevance and meaningfulness, the conversation in the classroom was like, whoa, did you know that such and such was correlated with this? Do you know women earn less than? And they were really into it. They all did the stats, right? So content, yeah. Meaning, very much so. So we can do that. If you can do that in stats, you can do that in mathematics, you can do that in chemistry, right? And you can do that in the humanities. And then going even further out, authentic audiences, can you do project and community-based learning? Laverne University down the road from me does community-based, asset-based community development work with their students who go and work with community partners. And there's a kinesiology professor, work with a community partner who was doing physical education with young kids. And the undergrads went and worked with those students to apply the kinesiology knowledge and then were assessed on that. So community-based learning is powerful, not broad enough, but it's an idea for you to challenge yourself to say, I want to learn about community-based learning. How can I do it in chemistry? How can I do it in history? How can I do it in English writing classes, right? Getting students to have real audiences. So I taught a class on public speaking and communication, and they did public presentations of whatever their favorite topic was to their peers at the college level, but they invited family and friends. And the feeling of, oh, it's for real was so motivating. They worked so hard. They were harder on themselves than I would ever have been, but they wanted to perform well. If they put up an exhibition of their study of, say, an ecosystem, and they had to walk visitors through it. If we did conferences and panel presentations with our students, but the assessment is that too many of us do that and then have the final exam. Why can't we stop there? Right? And you can have the final exam if you must, but these things don't seem rigorous, but if you build your rubric right, it can be even more rigorous than the final exam because you can have the rigor of assessing life skills and preparation for the future. So this is pretty big in terms of the scope of what you might do with this. This is best done at department levels, but you can edge into this. Just do one little project, one little panel discussion, one poster exhibition, and just test the waters. It might change radically what you are trying to achieve with your students. Okay. That was a lot of different ways of working. I want to leave you, so where hope I've taken you is to see this proposal. This is my proposal. I'm trying to bring out to everybody I know is how do we do assessments that measure learning rather than privilege? I think we need to propose that this is what we do. I also propose that we need flexible and meaningful processes where teachers and learners work together in ways that recognize and invite in all that diversity. And I think we need processes that make students feel that they matter, right? So sometimes, sadly, the class is really wonderful and people feel they matter, but the assessment is cold and unforgiving and you don't matter, I'm going to grade you on the curve. So that they matter and they can succeed in learning and in life. I want to bring the future world into our idea of assessment. So these are my proposals. And what I'd like you to do is, I'm going to stop for a moment because that's a lot to take in. Give you a few minutes to revisit your earlier definition. Are there changes or expansions you want to make so that you can walk away with that for yourself, right? And as you are doing that, you may want to also be thinking, what will you leave with? What can you do in your own context? And what comments and questions do you have? There are plenty in the chat, so we'll look at that. All right. So take a few minutes to revisit that definition. Oh, it's some great ideas in the chat. So I'm going to save that and put that into the slides. Hmm. Okay. I just want to walk you through the resources so you know what's there, and I will be adding more to it based on what we've talked about. But let me just show you what's there for the moment. So some basic references that might be useful to you. Uri Bronfenbrenner's work, if you don't know it, is a really good one to read with your mind on the idea of systems thinking for equity. Emotions in Learning, that's Sarah Rose Kavanagh's book. K-Cell, the Social Emotional Learning, that's a website. And I think this is really, it's used a lot in K-12. It's now beginning to creep into higher ed. So it's a really good, they have a beautiful model that might be very useful to help you bring that thinking about assessment and emotions together. The UDL website is amazing, of course, many of you know it. The interactive model they have give you lots of ideas because you can drill down to get strategies. Multi-Literacies is a whole big website that gives you publications, strategies, research on this. Yeah, summer reading list. And this is, I'm trying not to put too much in here, but I'm putting like a curation of what informed this particular presentation. Although, like, I forgot about Brene Brown, so I will add her. Fink's book, the 2 books by Freire. I'm thinking, I was going to put everybody in, and maybe I will now go and do that. But Bettina Love, Geneva Gay, Latson Billings, all these people. Bell Hooks, Bell Hooks is amazing. He talks about joy in learning, transgressions, and so you are in this transgressing the legacy assessment. Research on authentic assessment. So these 4 are a really interesting set to take a look at on what authentic assessments have been, where they've been used, and how people are doing. The one by Martinez and others, the critical pedagogy idea, is really also a very good one, authenticity in learning. And this is all the transparent design stuff. So Winklemis, who led this thing, this is in the AACU journal that tells you what the research was. and then some teachers actually sharing what they did, and then an example of transparent design. You want to listen to Dweck talking about the power of yet. And finally, Marianne Winklemas herself talking about the project. These are short videos, so there'll be a quick viewing. So I want to go back to, and I'm going to stop sharing slides and let's talk about this. And I see the hard part, yeah, STEM, breaking the paradigm. But I have some good news for everyone about STEM. Okay, so I will stop sharing now and say that you will have this set of slides. If any point during our conversation, for those who can stay, you would like to see the slides again, we can always pull them up, but it's much nicer to just look at each other and talk. If you can't stay, please know that you will have this set of slides. And actually, Jarek, can I ask you, let me stop sharing. How do you distribute the slides to everyone?
Okay, so the recording and the slides are going to be distributed via the listserv, and people who send me emails directly, I'm happy to forward those materials to them as well. So again, the listserv is definitely going to be there. I try to stay on top of it. I apologize, I have gardeners next door. I will just stop the recording and we'll talk, but it gets really loud in here. So Stacy Teeters is here, our guided pathways coordinator from Southern California. Stacy, please, if you could moderate the discussion, I'd really appreciate it. I cannot even hear myself right now, sorry.
Yeah, we can't hear the gardeners. Yeah.